It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
Eddie Van Halen changed rock music forever. His innovative technique, explosive solos, and unique sound revolutionized what was possible on the electric guitar. But behind the legend's infectious smile and groundbreaking performances existed a complex web of relationships with fellow guitarists, some inspiring, others deeply disappointing. Throughout his career, Eddie experienced rejection from his heroes, competition from his peers, and the sting of being copied by those he once admired. These are the stories of 6 guitarists who complicated Eddie's journey, revealing the human side of a man often regarded as superhuman. Every great guitarist has a starting point, and for Eddie Van Halen, that beginning was Eric Clapton. Growing up in Pasadena, young Eddie would spend countless hours in his bedroom with a cheap guitar, meticulously studying Clapton's work with Cream. He was particularly obsessed with the live version of Crossroads, where Clapton's Les Paul seemed to breathe fire through the speakers. Eddie didn't just listen casually. He dissected every note, every bend, every pause. In interviews throughout his life, Eddie consistently named Clapton as his primary influence, the reason he dedicated himself to the guitar in the first place. Eddie once explained that Clapton represented everything he wanted to achieve as a musician. The tone, the phrasing, the emotional depth these elements shaped Eddie's early understanding of what the guitar could express. He practiced obsessively, trying to capture that elusive quality that made Clapton's playing so compelling. It wasn't about copying, it was about understanding the language of blues-based rock guitar from someone who spoke it fluently. But as Eddie's career exploded in the late 1970s, something shifted. Van Halen's debut album introduced a completely new approach to guitar playing. Eddie's two-handed tapping technique, harmonic manipulation, and innovative use of the whammy bar created sounds that seemed to come from another dimension. While Clapton had mastered traditional blues rock guitar, Eddie was inventing an entirely new vocabulary. The student had not just learned from the master, he had ventured into unexplored territory. The breaking point came when Clapton was asked about Van Halen's playing in 1980. His response, describing Eddie as technically proficient but lacking soul, devastated the young guitarist. For someone who had worshipped Clapton, who had built his foundation on Clapton's music, this dismissal felt like a rejection not just of his technique, but of his entire artistic vision. Eddie later admitted that the comment genuinely hurt him, breaking something fundamental in how he viewed his musical heroes. This conflict highlighted a generational and philosophical divide. Clapton's approach emphasized restraint, space, and blues tradition. Every note mattered because of what it said emotionally. Eddie's style embraced excess, experimentation, and technical boundary pushing. He played with abandon, using distortion and feedback as compositional tools rather than obstacles to overcome. These were 2 fundamentally different philosophies about what guitar playing should be. Despite the pain, Eddie never publicly attacked Clapton. He processed the disappointment privately, eventually reaching a mature perspective. He recognized that Clapton represented a specific era and approach, while he represented the future. They were, as Eddie eventually put it, from different planets. One painted with traditional blues colors, the other splashed neon across an electric canvas. When Eddie and Clapton finally met in Los Angeles during the mid-1980s, the encounter was cordial but distant. Eddie approached it hopefully, still carrying some of that teenage fan energy. But the conversation remained superficial, focused on technical gear talk rather than anything deeper. Afterward, Eddie reflected that he had loved the myth more than the man, a realization that changed how he viewed all his musical heroes. By the time Eddie reached his later years, he had made peace with the Clapton situation. He acknowledged that without Clapton's influence, he might never have picked up the guitar. Whatever Clapton thought of his playing didn't diminish that fundamental debt. Eddie's final perspective showed growth. He could hold both the disappointment and the gratitude simultaneously, understanding that heroes are human and that their approval, while desired, isn't necessary for artistic validation. Ritchie Blackmore represented another crucial influence on young Eddie Van Halen. As the guitarist for Deep Purple and later Rainbow, Blackmore combined classical precision with hard rock intensity. His solos on tracks like Highway Star and Burn demonstrated technical mastery wrapped in dark, dramatic flair. Eddie studied these performances religiously, absorbing Blackmore's approach to tone, distortion, and compositional structure. When Van Halen achieved stardom, Eddie suddenly found himself in the same circles as Blackmore. This should have been a dream come true, the opportunity to meet and possibly befriend one of his guitar heroes. Instead, their first encounter became one of Eddie's most disappointing memories. According to Eddie's own account, Blackmore simply stared at him, without acknowledgement. No greeting, no handshake, no recognition, just a cold, distant look that communicated indifference or perhaps even hostility. This moment wounded Eddie deeply. He wasn't approaching Blackmore with arrogance or competition in mind. He was genuinely excited to meet someone whose music had shaped his development. The silent rejection hit harder than any verbal criticism could have. Eddie later described it as receiving the shaft with their eyes, a phrase that perfectly captured the nonverbal dismissal. Blackmore's personality contributed to this dynamic. Known for being difficult and mercurial even with his own bandmates, Blackmore cultivated an aura of mystique and distance. His public persona depended on maintaining separation from fans and peers alike. When asked about Van Halen's playing, Blackmore offered faint praise tinged with criticism, suggesting Eddie played too many notes, a backhanded compliment that implied technical excess without musical substance. This critique revealed the philosophical gap between them. Blackmore's style drew from classical music's emphasis on structure and restraint. Every note served a specific purpose within a carefully constructed framework. Eddie's approach was liberating and explosive, prioritizing feel and innovation over traditional compositional rules. Where Blackmore represented disciplined British hard rock, Eddie embodied the California sound, experimental, unbound, and future-focused. Despite the initial coldness, Eddie eventually developed a more understanding perspective. He recognized that perhaps Blackmore had been uncomfortable or unsure how to respond. Maybe the British guitarist's shyness was mistaken for arrogance. Eddie's mature reflection showed his characteristic generosity, choosing to give Blackmore the benefit of the doubt rather than nursing a grudge. Interestingly, Blackmore's view softened over time as well. Years later, he acknowledged Eddie's contributions to guitar playing, recognizing the innovation in his tapping technique and whammy bar manipulation. While this validation came decades late, it demonstrated that even skeptical veterans eventually had to acknowledge what Eddie had accomplished. The late 1970s tour circuit brought Van Halen into contact with established rock royalty, including Aerosmith's Joe Perry. For Eddie, still in his early 20s and proving himself night after night, these encounters with guitar heroes should have been exciting. Instead, he faced a wall of cold indifference from many of the players he had admired growing up. Eddie specifically mentioned Joe Perry as one of the guitarists who gave him the shaft with their eyes during those early tours. There was no warmth, no mentorship, no collegial acknowledgement, just a dismissive attitude that communicated Eddie wasn't welcome in their club. This rejection stung because Eddie approached these situations with openness and enthusiasm. He wasn't trying to challenge anyone's position, he simply loved guitar and wanted to connect with fellow players. Perry represented the blues-based, riff-heavy approach that defined 1970s hard rock. His work with Aerosmith was built on groove, attitude, and raw swagger. Eddie's technical innovations and futuristic sound represented a threat to this established order. For veterans like Perry, Eddie's playing might have seemed like an invasion rather than evolution, a fundamental challenge to everything they had built their careers on. Eddie's assessment was direct. These established players felt threatened and therefore refused to be encouraging or helpful. It wasn't personal malice, but professional insecurity. The generational shift Eddie represented was undeniable, and acknowledging his talent meant accepting that the guitar world was changing in ways that might leave them behind. Despite this early coldness, Eddie never became bitter. He continued playing with joy and passion, driven by love of music rather than desire for approval from the old guard. His philosophy was simple. He enjoyed playing guitar, whether in a massive arena or a small lounge. The music itself was the reward, not the validation from other musicians. Time eventually brought Joe Perry to a complete reversal of his position. By the 2010s, Perry spoke openly about being blown away by Van Halen's debut album, describing Eddie's playing as phenomenal and revolutionary. He admitted to repeatedly studying Eddie's techniques, trying to understand the innovations that made his sound so distinctive. Perry's later praise was generous and sincere, acknowledging that Eddie had taken existing influences and created something entirely new. This transformation in Perry's perspective validated Eddie's impact, but came too late to erase those early hurts. Eddie had long since stopped seeking approval from his heroes, having learned that respect must be earned on your own terms rather than granted by those who came before. Tom Scholz presented a unique challenge in Eddie's career. A player who seemed to be directly copying his innovations in real time. The incident that crystallized their tension occurred at an outdoor festival in the late 1970s, where Van Halen performed immediately before Boston. Eddie had just finished his revolutionary solo spot when Scholz took the stage and performed what sounded remarkably similar to Eddie's signature techniques. The situation was particularly uncomfortable because Eddie was standing visible to the audience, creating a bizarre dynamic where fans watched Scholz play Eddie's innovations while the originator stood nearby. Eddie later admitted he was angry about the situation, feeling that his unique musical identity was being borrowed without acknowledgement or permission. The personal dynamics made it worse. Scholz wasn't friendly or communicative backstage. He would arrive, perform, and leave without socializing or acknowledging fellow musicians. This combination of imitation and aloofness frustrated Eddie, who valued authenticity and originality above all else in guitar playing. Scholz and Eddie represented opposite approaches to music creation. Scholz, with his mid-engineering background, approached music scientifically. He built his own recording equipment, meticulously controlled every sonic variable, and created Boston's polished, perfected sound in his basement studio. Eddie operated on instinct and feel, building guitars by hand and chasing sounds through experimentation rather than calculation. For Eddie, originality was sacred. He had invented his sound through countless hours of experimentation, destroying equipment and pushing boundaries. Seeing someone mirror that hard-won innovation felt like theft of identity. Eddie's philosophy was clear. You can be inspired by others, but you must evolve and develop your own voice. Simply replicating someone else's techniques and style meant living in their shadow rather than creating your own light. Scholz never publicly addressed the incident, maintaining his characteristic privacy. His reserved personality naturally conflicted with Eddie's open, engaging approach. While Eddie would spend hours talking gear with anyone interested, Scholz preferred isolation and technical perfection. Despite the friction, both men eventually acknowledged mutual respect. Scholz admitted Eddie possessed imagination that couldn't be taught, while Eddie recognized that anyone who built their own equipment and pushed sonic boundaries deserved respect. The tension gradually faded into acknowledgement of different but equally valid approaches to guitar and music creation. The Rick Derringer situation represented Eddie's most direct confrontation over artistic theft. In 1978, as Van Halen's debut album was making Eddie a household name, Derringer opened several shows for the band. What should have been a respectful pairing of generations became a source of genuine anger for Eddie. After watching Derringer perform, Eddie confronted him directly. He explained that he had grown up admiring Derringer's work and didn't mind if Derringer used tapping as a technique, but he drew a firm line at copying his specific solos note for note. It wasn't about technique ownership. It was about melodic and compositional identity. When Derringer repeated the same copying the following night, even closing with Van Halen's signature, "You really got me," Eddie took action. Derringer was removed from the tour. This wasn't ego or insecurity. It was about protecting the creative work that defined Van Halen's emerging identity. Eddie had developed his sound through years of experimentation and innovation. His solos weren't just displays of technique, they were compositions in themselves, carefully crafted to express specific musical ideas. Watching someone replicate them exactly, especially in front of the same audiences, felt like watching someone steal his voice. The situation carried particular irony because Eddie admitted he had copied some of Derringer's techniques in his early development, but Eddie understood the difference between learning from influences and wholesale replication. He had taken inspiration from Derringer and many others, then synthesized those influences into something uniquely his own. What Derringer was doing crossed from inspiration into imitation. Eddie's father had taught him an important principle: if you play someone else's song, make it your own. This lesson shaped Eddie's entire approach to music. Every cover Van Halen performed was transformed, reimagined through Eddie's distinctive sound and style. He expected the same respect for his own compositions. The Derringer incident became a defining moment in understanding fame's complications. As Eddie's techniques spread throughout the guitar world, countless players would attempt to replicate his sound. But professionals copying his work in public performances, especially those he had admired, represented a different level of appropriation that demanded response. Over time, Eddie developed perspective on the situation. By the 1990s, he could discuss it with humor, recognizing his younger self's intensity while still maintaining that boundaries had been necessary. Derringer never explicitly confirmed or denied the story, though he later acknowledged Eddie's extraordinary talent in general terms. The relationship between Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads was perhaps the most complex and emotionally charged of all these dynamics. Unlike the others, this wasn't about disappointment from a hero or frustration with imitators. This was pure rivalry between two young guitarists who were simultaneously revolutionizing rock guitar in the early 1980s. Randy Rhoads, best known for his work with Ozzy Osbourne, came from classical training and brought precision and compositional sophistication to heavy metal guitar. Where Eddie was instinctive and explosive, Randy was measured and structured. Both were brilliant, both were innovating, and both were constantly compared to each other by fans and media. Eddie's comments about Rhoads, preserved in archive audio, revealed complicated feelings. He acknowledged Randy's honesty in crediting Eddie as an influence, praised his abilities, but immediately asserted that Randy hadn't done anything Eddie himself hadn't already pioneered. This defensive posture suggested deep concern about being eclipsed or having his innovations attributed to someone else. The constant comparisons aided both guitarists. Eddie had sparked the guitar revolution with techniques that redefined what was possible, but Randy was applying similar innovations with classical precision and theoretical knowledge that appealed to more technically minded listeners. The media and fans couldn't resist pitting them against each other, creating an artificial competition that probably exceeded the actual animosity between them.